All right, I think we're getting live here, so we'll just wait for a few people to come on in. Very good. So thank you everyone for joining us tonight. We're sitting down with Dr. David Bromell, the author of Regulation of Free Speech in a Digital Age, Hate, Harm, and the Limits of Censorship. It's exactly, as we say, in the wheelhouse of what the Free Speech Union is to deal with. And if you've joined us for some of these events before, you'll know here at the Free Speech Union, we're not free speech absolutists. It's not a cause about saying anyone go and say anything, anytime, and have your way. But free speech also operates as the foundation on which a liberal, peaceful, democratic society operates. And so what are the limitations of that? Where do they lie? And the tensions that come in that are complex. So to help us unpack that tonight with Dr. David Bromell, thank you for joining us. It's nice to sit down with you.
Oh, nice to have a chat.
So you've recently released this very engaging book, Regulation of Free Speech in a Digital Age. I comment to the team from time to time, I think this is one of the most challenging issues in public policy at the moment, this transition from the commons that we've known in person into a digital space, into an online sphere where we interact in virtually every space in our life remotely. What are the implications for that? Kind of starting off with a really high level picture. As you've discussed that, what are the implications of the digital aspect on free speech?
Oh, well, where to start? Perhaps I'll start with just the ambiguity of human being and all human enterprise. I mean, the internet's wonderful. I was in lockdown due to COVID in Germany while I was researching this book. But I could do nearly all my research online. I could engage with other researchers online. I could keep contact with family and friends. I could make all my travel arrangements without having to go and talk to anyone face to face, and so on.
And all in the same time zone because you're in Germany.
Yes. And yet the internet is full of nasty stuff, terrorist and violent extremist content, pornography, misinformation, disinformation, hate speech, and far too many cat videos. So you look at just the moral ambiguity of it and the worldwide reach of it. So it's not a simple or straightforward thing for a little country like New Zealand to say, we need to clean up the internet.
Though we've done our best to contribute to that very complex question nonetheless, though. Your book starts at least outlining what happened March 15th, 3 years ago, you know, when that horrible attack happened on our shores, and the response that New Zealand had and our government had in initiating the Christchurch call and drawing together leaders from around the world, both governmental and non-governmental actors, to try and address some of this. And in response to that, we've also had a real rise in the conversation we're having as a nation now around hate speech. So we've kind of talked about some of the difficulties that arise from speech on the internet, and one of them is hate speech. Can you define that term for us? What does hate speech mean?
I found I had to think through the difference between hate crime and hate speech. It's an important distinction because with a hate crime, somebody commits an act that is already a criminal offence, like assault and injury to another person, a terrorist act, damage to property. And the motivation is hatred or hostility towards the victim or victims. So hate crimes are criminal actions motivated by hostility, and the actions are independently illegal. With hate speech, the issue isn't so much hate as motivation, but hatred as a likely effect of certain forms of speech. So the act of talking or of communicating is not itself illegal. It's not a criminal act. The concern is that the speaker's communication might incite or stir up other people to discriminate or act out hostility or violence towards members of a social group. When I dug into this, I found there is no agreed international legal definition of hate speech. Article 19 of the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights protects the right to freedom of opinion and expression, but it is a qualified right, and there are circumstances in which a state may justifiably restrict freedom of expression, provided the restrictions are lawful, necessary, and proportionate. And Article 20 goes on to say that advocacy of national, racial, or religious hatred that constitutes incitement to discrimination, hostility, or violence shall be prohibited by law. So based on international human rights standards, the way that I've ended up defining hate speech is public but not private communication that intends or is imminently likely to incite discrimination, acts of hostility, or violence against members of a social group with a protected characteristic like nationality, race, or religion. So hate speech doesn't have to be directly connected to action, but it does have to incite others to actions, discrimination, acts of hostility or violence. So hate speech is more than criticism, satire, or insult that causes offence and hurt feelings.
What you're teasing out there is this middle ground, this tension between what is purely speech and opinion and what is overtly action, and the middle ground where the two do overlap. And you wrote very poignantly in your book, you said, yes, words can hurt. And I think whether we use a really dramatic example like the Christchurch attack, or simply everyday examples that we all interact with, we know that words can hurt. But you go on to say, but they do not hurt in the same way or to the same extent as sticks and stones, knives and guns. Words are not triggers. Arguments are not weapons. They are what are used instead of weapons. And I think we often forget that this peaceful society that we've inherited, that we are lucky enough to inhabit, actually we have because we've developed a way to disagree and to disagree peacefully. Do you think as a society we are losing sight of what generations and centuries of tolerance and acceptance, that you can say virtually anything you want, but you can't act on anything you want? Do you think we're losing sight of that, and it's actually endangering what is the peaceful status quo?
Yeah, I think there is a risk of that. And I do want to acknowledge that words can hurt. They're not harmless. And when hate speech, as I've defined it, incites and stirs up discrimination, hostility, or violence, words can cause real harm. And as a citizen, I also don't want to live in an environment that is contaminated by ugly mouthing off in public places, or discriminatory graffiti in posters, or implicit threats of violence toward myself or others. Now, whether I experience that in my physical environment or in digital media, I would love to see us tone down the anger, recover the lost art of civility, and learn to disagree agreeably. But
Now,
I don't.
can I pick up on that?
Yeah.
Do we find ourselves in an increasingly uncivil environment? I think something very few could disagree with. We in the West, especially, we exist in increasingly polarized environments, and there's a lot of explanations for that. Do you think it is because we have a greater variety of opinions than we have in the past, and so those differences that we're trying to bridge really are more significant? Or do you think it's simply that we've always had significant disagreements, we've lost the capacity to bridge them, though?
I think particularly in immigrant receiving societies like New Zealand, we have evolved from diverse societies to super diverse societies. And diversity brings conflicts of ideas, beliefs, values, and ways of life. And that conflict is inevitable and inescapable. And I don't think it works to just treat us like children playing in a sandpit and say, be kind and play nicely with others. This super diverse society we live in, people genuinely want and value different things. And our differences run so deep that our life together unavoidably involves conflict. But in a liberal democracy, the idea is that we manage that conflict politically, institutionally, under the rule of law. We don't have to agree with or approve of one another's ideas, beliefs, values, or ways of life. But the bottom line is that we have to tolerate what we dislike in each other and resolve our conflicts lawfully as best we can, and above all, not resort to violence. So, as you put it, words are what we use instead of violence. And of course, words can hurt, but they don't hurt us in the same way or to the same extent as sticks and stones, knives and bullets. I don't like being insulted, verbally abused, laughed at, or joked about, but I'd sooner be insulted than assaulted. And of course, I prefer a conversation in which we engage in argument in a respectful way, even if we end up still disagreeing, because I've often been proved wrong and I've changed my mind about many things over the course of my life.
Well, these are relative gains, aren't they? You're saying, of course, insult is not what we should aim for, but it's better than assault. And once we get to insult, we can continue to go beyond there. The famous saying, free speech is not what you give to your friends, it's what you give to your enemies. And I think in many ways, our society at the moment, and perhaps my generation in particular, has lost sight of that. Where do you think that comes from? You write quite a lot about cancel culture and these newfound phenomena in many ways, and we may say that they come from the digital material that we're able to engage with now, but there's a generational aspect of that also. Cancellation, is that consistent at all with free speech?
I don't think so. I don't really understand where it's come from, but it's not only here in New Zealand, of course. And in other ways, it takes us back to older traditions that I wish we'd left behind, of heresy trials and witch hunts, of driving people out and making them exist beyond the pale, assigning them to non-personhood, taking their name away from them. I was really struck by a sculpture that I saw on the wall of a church in a village north of Düsseldorf when I was in Germany, that showed Friedrich Spee, who was a Jesuit who opposed the witch trials of the 17th century, and he's holding in his arms a woman who has been accused of being a witch. The incredible damage that this does of ostracizing, shunning, shaming, and I'm sad to see some of these practices creeping back into how we relate to one another. Social media in some ways makes it worse, because you can hurl an insult at someone over Twitter or on Facebook with no sense of consequence to yourself. And I think there's some real work to be done on learning how to maintain civility in the digital sphere.
And so you point out the absence of consequences, and so an obvious response might be, well, is if we had more consequences associated with the imprudent speech that people use, then perhaps we'd be able to control this more. But the thesis of your book in some way is that often there are unintended consequences of governmental or legal censorship, and not only is it often ineffective, it's often counterproductive. So when you say that there is a lack of consequences, do you imagine that there is a way we could foster social consequences, or that might spur an ostracization again? How do you imagine we can encourage people to operate in civility in these online spaces?
Yeah, well, I was coming at this as someone who's worked as a public policy practitioner, and what I look for is a principled pragmatism. So first off, I started, well, Christchurch call is to eliminate terrorist and violent extremist content from the internet. And as soon as I saw that, I thought, well, that ain't going to happen. And so first I turned my mind to practically what can be done and what can't be done to control our discourse on digital media. And the first half of the book is about that. But then I went on to the second half of the book as well. Even when we thought through what we can and can't do, what should and shouldn't we do in a free and open society? And that gets into the principles around freedom of opinion and expression, and justifiable restrictions on that.
Sorry, go ahead.
And the big question for me around moderation of content was first, well, who do we want to call the shots? Do we want private companies, in effect, acting as courts to determine the boundaries of free speech, and largely using algorithms to do that rather than human content moderators? So an incredible risk of overreach. Or do we want the framework for that content regulation to be set by democratically elected governments and the courts in ways that are transparent and open to review and appeal? And can we do this in a way that reins in the inordinate power of big tech companies that have formed a sort of oligopoly, and whose primary imperative is to generate profit and a return to their shareholders? But equally, how much power do we want to give to government to control speech? Because governments have got a fairly well-established pattern of trying to control discourse for their own political purposes. And there's a lot of surveys of what's going on around the world, of just how little real freedom there is for communication and the sharing of opinion on the internet. So, Freedom House, for example, reported in the year to May 2021, global internet freedom had declined for the 11th consecutive year.
Wow.
Governments suspended internet access in at least 20 countries, and 21 states blocked access to social media platforms, usually during times of political turmoil, such as protests and elections, or using COVID as the excuse. And some of those countries are ostensibly democratic. The Democracy Project's country scores for 2021 counted only 21 full democracies, including Australia and New Zealand, 53 flawed democracies, including the US and a number of Western European countries, 59 authoritarian countries, and 34 hybrid regimes. So free speech is really under threat. So how much power do I want a government to have over this? And so what I end up looking for is some form of co-regulation and multi-stakeholder governance that pulls in tech companies in the private sector, governments, and especially intergovernmental regulation, society organisations, and also the press, the fourth estate. It needs checks and balances. because we've got as much to fear from governments as we've got to fear from um, big business.
And as you've considered that conversation in the context of New Zealand, where, as you pointed out before, we've become super diverse. We have a lot of migrant populations that are minorities in our communities. Ostensibly, the hate speech laws that were proposed in many ways were being proposed for these ethnic minorities and in order to protect speech about them. But at that same moment, it almost struck to the foundation of the free speech that was also for these minority groups. And
Yes.
we see many, many examples around the world where these hate speech laws are initially introduced. And before long, because they are democratic governments, so the majority rules, those same hate speech laws can be turned against the people they were intended to protect. Do you see civil society as a safeguard, as a catch on that to ensure that as we try and bring in some form of government regulation that isn't then abused, or what do you think is a better way to try and have those checks and balances in place?
Yeah, I absolutely think that civil society needs a place at the table. But it is about checks and balances. And I completely agree that if you're a member of a minority social group and you're calling for hate speech laws, my advice would be careful what you wish for.
Mm. Absolutely. And so in New Zealand, we don't really, as far as I can tell, I don't think we have that same commitment to the responsibility of civil society as we perhaps do in other countries. Do you think that comes as by virtue of the fact that previously we've been a more homogenous society? We haven't needed those same safeguards, or how do you think we can encourage that to develop a stronger civil commitment in this space to cooperate with and to hold in check government that is going to use these extraordinary powers?
Yeah, there's something I notice in New Zealand that whenever something bad happens, the first reactions are the government should have prevented this. So let's have an inquiry. And then the second reaction follows soon after is there should be a law against it. We have this implicit assumption that government is the answer to everything. So I found it really helpful to think about some of these issues in Germany, where civil society organisations play more of a role with support from government. And when I started looking at examples around the world, I was, of civil society organisations that address hate and harm, that build social capital and social cohesion, that work with people at risk of being recruited into alt-right organisations, and help people exit from them. I was thinking of agents of organisations like Moonshot CVE with its redirect method, the Institute for Strategic Dialogue, Hope Not Hate, Tell Mama in the UK, the Amadeo Antonio Stiftung in Germany. In Baden-Württemberg, they've got a democracy centre and a respect program. A wonderful organisation in Germany and Austria called Omas gegen Rechts, Grandmas Against the Right. And I don't see so much of this kind of civil society organisation in New Zealand.
We need a Nanas United or something like that here.
Yeah, with the grandpas getting involved as well. And my personal commitment to this since 2010 has been through volunteering with English Language Partners New Zealand. First as a home tutor and then as a trustee since 2015. And we teach English and work with former refugees and migrants across New Zealand to enable them to settle well and succeed here, to feel safe, to belong, to participate, to contribute in all aspects of life. And it's very hard to do that if we don't speak a common language. And I've recently got involved in a local community initiative here, which we're still shaping up the project, but we've reserved a domain name Community of Strangers to just capture this idea that we can be different, but affirm our common humanity and our common interests in a well-functioning civil society. This is the kind of thing we need to do. But of course, building genuine social cohesion mustn't come at the expense of free speech. We don't create unity by suppressing difference or restricting freedom of expression and opinion. So organisations like the Free Speech Union have a critical role in reminding us of this. The challenge for me is to recognise both our diversity and our common humanity and common citizenship.
And so as you assess the context here in which the government has shelved their hate speech laws, we haven't seen a commitment per se that they won't be introduced before the end of the term, but nor have we seen a commitment that they will be. Do you think, as a professor of the School of Government there, do you think this is coming from a political reaction or from a thoughtful reaction that has considered some of these intricacies that you're talking about? Is it a polling question, or do you think the government is saying, okay, maybe we're not the best actor to respond to this issue that is legitimate and considerable, and that we should be looking to respond in other ways?
Jonathan, I really don't know, because the whole process has not been very transparent. The reform of hate speech laws was announced by Andrew Little, like just 2 weeks after the terrorist attack on Christchurch mosques. And what was promised was, wide consultation and engagement of communities. But the conversations have happened with, what the government calls affected communities, minority groups, perhaps, who were most intimately affected by the attack on the mosques, and some others, presumably. But there hasn't been a lot of transparency about it until the Ministry of Justice released the proposals earlier in the year. When Andrew Little first announced that they would do something about hate speech, my immediate reaction at the time was, I hope they realise that this isn't a straightforward issue. And that was one of my drivers for getting into this piece of research. And I was very privileged to be able to take up a research fellowship, which gave me time to do some reading and thinking and writing, I hope, as a contribution to fellow policy practitioners who have to provide advice to government and help ministers make sense of this and find a sound way to proceed. So yeah, we'll see where it goes.
What was your experience like in Germany there, writing on such a complex issue in a relatively different context? Germany has and many European countries, because of the violent experiences that they've had in the past, have had quite strong controls on speech of certain kinds, such as Holocaust denial and such. Writing in that sort of context, do you think those laws have limited the full expression of a liberal democracy in those societies?
There's a sort of mixed reports about Germany's Network Enforcement Act, the so-called Netzdege, which has recently been strengthened. On the one hand, it doesn't seem to have led to a lot of overreach or over censorship, and it does mean that Facebook, for example, employs a disproportionately large percentage of content moderators in Germany in order to avoid the fines. But on the other hand, there were other regimes that seized on the Network Enforcement Act as a model for much more dangerous content regulation in states that are sliding in an authoritarian direction. And I think it must have been of some disappointment to Germany that France's constitutional court struck down a law modelled on it. But the thing about Europe is that the European Union has been doing such solid work on this in its digital strategy since at least December 2020. And it's worked particularly on a Digital Services Act and a Digital Markets Act. I think will lead the way on sensible intergovernmental regulation of social media and the internet. The one caution I'd sound is that for some reason, governments seem to leap to content regulation when I think what we should be focusing on is platform design and processes. And the European Union is doing some of that. Yeah, we need to address the lack of competition in the sector, the monopolistic behaviours, the lack of algorithmic transparency, the way those algorithms drive user engagement in what gets shown to us in our news feed, and introducing us always to more content like what we've already seen, only more extreme, to try and keep us hooked so that they can sell targeted advertising to us. I think this is the kind of stuff, and the lack of interoperability between platforms that government regulation could better address than content regulation. Because if a lot of that was addressed, the content regulation would sort itself out.
Right, yeah. You also in your book talk about an element of personal responsibility and iterate a call that is at the heart of our work here. And you wrote, regulation is not the best or only answer. Counter speech is everyone's responsibility. And if we value the political tradition of liberalism and the reduction in violence it has made possible, we will resist the temptation to revive older traditions, like you said before, the witch trials and jihad and crusades. Controlled speech, at least in the West, doesn't actually come from overt prohibitions from political actors for the most part, but often it comes from self-censorship. And I think in New Zealand, we're very aware of, within social environments, what is acceptable, perhaps unacceptable to say. And so respond to that. And that's basic manners at one level, but taken to an extreme, it can often present a real inhibition to our speech rights. How do you think we promote counter speech in an environment like this, and how do we build credibility in the idea that debate and discussion and disagreement are the way forward and how we progress as a society?
Yeah, I think this is a growing problem, including in our universities and research institutions and in public media, where I would most expect the right to freedom of opinion and expression to prevail. If anyone dares to voice a challenge to current woke orthodoxies, they are angrily denounced as racist, misogynist, or phobic, whether it's homophobic, transphobic, fatphobic, or whatever. David Seymour's copped it this week for proposing a referendum on Maori co-governance. Abusively labelling a speaker and attacking the person instead of engaging with the argument is dangerous because it shuts down conversation. And if we respond by self-censoring and we stop talking in public, the risk is that then we talk only in private, and most likely only with people who already share our views. So we then create filter bubbles and echo chambers where the information we access and the opinions we hear tend to confirm and amplify what we already feel, think, believe, and value. We lose opportunities for challenge, for nuance and correction, and exposure to new and different ideas. Within both the public sector and academia, I've tried to normalise the value of disagreement and debate through the practice of peer review. Collective thinking makes for better analysis and advice. I never wanted a report to go to a minister unless it had been thoroughly peer reviewed by at least two people. Criticism and review correct and improve our arguments and how we present them. Long term, I think the answer lies in education. Education in civics, human rights, critical thinking, including media and digital literacy, and conflict resolution. And that needs to carry through from primary to tertiary education. In Finland, media literacy education starts in primary school, whereas in New Zealand, for whatever reason, the Ministry of Education decided in 2020 to drop media studies from MCEA Level 1, which for me is a step in completely the wrong direction. I'd also like to see a much clearer distinction between reporting and opinion in public news media. Tell us what has happened and is happening. Don't tell us what to think about it. And provide well-researched analysis and commentary from a variety of perspectives, but don't confuse news reporting with opinion writing. We really don't need journalists and broadcasters who aspire to be social influencers and celebrities.
And yet that is what we have in buckets, isn't it? Just today,
Yeah.
The Free Speech Union has engaged in a bit of a back and forth on NBR, the National Business Review, on exactly what you're saying there. We've been alleged as being phobic and anti-minority groups, and that is the right of the columnist who wrote it to express those opinions. And so it's difficult for an organization like ours to respond and say it isn't the role of journalists to be making such hyperbolic claims, because the obvious and legitimate retort is, well, don't you agree with their free speech? And of course we do. Of course we stand for their right to free speech. So how do we make this argument that journalism should be about facts without superimposing our interpretation on it? But of course those journalists have a right to free speech as well. It seems, again, a tension there.
Well, it's much the same for a public servant, isn't it? And what Public Service Commission always says to us is keep your politics out of your job and your job out of your politics.
Easier said than done, though.
Yeah, it's something we have to stay vigilant about.
Mm-hmm. Mm. And it's interesting that you also point out education as a key component of that. As a part of the series that we're running, in 2 weeks, we'll be sitting down with Dr. Michael Johnson from the New Zealand Initiative and Mike Shaw, a principal of a school up in Kaikoui. And it'll be, I think to hear about ideas for how we can promote critical thinking in early years is crucial for our ability to then be able to distinguish between who someone is and what someone is saying. Have you, other than in Finland, in Germany, did you come across a kind of more engaged way of thinking than perhaps what we have here in New Zealand? Finland's held up as an educational kind of exemplar of how we should be approaching these issues. Is it similar in other parts of Europe?
I didn't look at the education side in Germany. But I did have a look at what some newsrooms and media authorities are doing. The State Media Authority for North Rhine-Westphalia, where I was living, for example, has had a program for some years called Pursue, Don't Just Delete. So when they become aware of illegal communication, for example, like real hate speech that's inciting, don't just moderate it and delete it. Don't just block it. Notify the appropriate authorities and prosecutors and retain evidence so that it could be prosecuted. That's also been a concern that's come out of the international criminal courts. But beyond that, they have like a 10-step program for newsrooms. And it includes things like hire a diverse journalism staff, invest properly in their training and support them. Look at the coverage of your stories and the range of angles that there's some really good stuff that is happening elsewhere that I think we could learn from.
You took an interesting stand in your book against what has commonly been done with regards to the Christchurch attack, which was to name the assailant there, the terrorist. And you wrote, wherever possible, we need to find ways to call in, not out. We don't clean up and reduce harm by thought vigilantism and cancelling those whose views we judge to be abhorrent, banishing them beyond the pale, making them non-persons for political purposes or willing them into non-existent. Do you think the Prime Minister's decision to not name the terrorist speaks to this desire to delete, as you said there, pursue instead of delete, just to block out, to take away from our view, to not be exposed to it, and then we won't think about it? I can't see the harm, there is no harm type approach?
Yeah, this is something I've thought about a lot, and thanks for the opportunity to explain. In her first media statement after the terrorist attack, the Prime Minister powerfully affirmed the nation's solidarity with the victims of the attack. They are us.
Mm.
But she then went on to say that the terrorist is not us and has no place in New Zealand. Now, I was troubled by this then, and I'm still troubled by it. This us, not us rhetoric. There's a risk, of course, that it implies that racism, xenophobia, and white nationalism are alien to New Zealand and have been imported here. So what we don't like or want or don't want to acknowledge about ourselves gets othered and projected onto people who don't belong here.
Huh.
And we saw some of this again recently in the othering of the protesters who occupied the grounds of Parliament. The electorate doesn't forget when politicians describe fellow citizens as ferals, deplorables, a river of filth, or bottom feeders. And as I thought about what the Prime Minister's rhetoric of us and not us, I remembered something I'd read in a wonderful book by Jeremy Waldron, One Another's Equals, The Basis of Human Equality. And Waldron uses the term scintillation to describe how we flick our attention back and forth between some relevant range property of being human and the particularity of how that is manifested in an individual person over a complete life. And Waldron suggests that this scintillation is what lets a society behave towards a terrorist both as a fellow human being who is entitled to protection from cruel or inhuman treatment and a fair trial, and as someone who, because of what they're alleged to have done, ought to be apprehended, tried according to the law, and if found guilty, punished. For Brenton Tarrant and his victims, the past is done and it can't be undone. But the future is always open to decision. Tarrant has been sentenced to life imprisonment without parole. He's still a young man and he's got many years ahead of him. His punishment is to be deprived of liberty for the rest of his life, not to be treated as a non-person without human dignity or rights. I want our prisons to serve restorative rather than retributive justice. And I hope and expect that there are staff in the Department of Corrections who are working with him on his rehabilitation, even though he will never be released from prison. Brenton Tarrant can change and become better than he is. When he was acting for Tarrant, lawyer Tony Ellis admitted to the chief coroner ahead of the coronial inquiry that denying Tarrant his name is deeply offensive and unlawful. It tries to render him a non-person and it's demeaning. And I know this is a hard call, especially for those who survived the attack and for the families, friends, and faith communities of those who were killed. But my reading of history tells me that nothing good ever comes from banishing anyone beyond the pale or willing them into non-existence. Yes, they, the victims, are us. And there is no one who is not us, not even a terrorist. This is who we are. All of us have pasts. All of us are flawed. We're all creatures in whom good and evil are strangely mixed. Now, how can we find ways to live together decently in freedom and equality and in ways that minimize domination, humiliation, cruelty, and violence? that's the challenge for a liberal democratic state.
Mm. What a rare but hopeful way of viewing that situation. So often when we look at these truly horrific incidences, it is very bleak as we contemplate the darkness that obviously does exist in some people's humanity, but it's one that points to redemption as well. And
Yes.
and I think there is a hope there that you're pointing to, and that's quite unique. It's interesting what you're saying around the they are us, but not us, the implicit nature of that as well. I often think in our national anthem, where I think it's the third verse that says, "Guard our country's spotless name," and I thought it's an incredibly hubris comment to make. I'm not sure where we thought we ever had a spotless name, but it's certainly not the case anymore. But there is an aspiration in that as well, isn't there? And I guess that's the tension that you're speaking to. Um, as we've discussed extensively here, liberal democracy is what underpins and is underpinned by free speech. We see this co-supportive relationship with free speech enables democracy, and democracy protects free speech. Within that, democracy is not a left-right issue, but it's interesting over decades, depending on what is vogue at the time or particular political persuasions, the right or the left may interchange in their tendencies towards censoriousness. How do you think we try and bridge that gap where the right can stray into authoritarianism, the left perhaps is more prone towards this cancellation type mentality? Is there a way, do you think, for us to, despite the differences between the political right and left, bridge that divide and say, but free speech is a commonality that we can both stand on? An accusation that we come from is that we're far left or far right, depending on who it is that's throwing the stones. And I think there's a credit to us in this sense that both sides would come at us with that pejorative. But do you think there's a way that we can say, actually, this isn't about politics, this is about ensuring that we have a path forward despite our disagreements?
Yeah, so I note on the forward that I see liberal democracy under threat on at least two fronts, and more characteristically from the right, a drift towards authoritarianism and populism, and currently, more characteristically on the left, this sort of censoriousness and cancel culture. But you're right, that tendency to want to censor and control speech isn't something you can neatly locate on a left-right axis. We just have to remain vigilant and defend liberal democracy as the least bad form of government. My first degrees were in history. And so I always want to say, remember our past. My research fellowship was in Bolcombe in North Rhine-Westphalia, and I couldn't help but think of the Peace of Westphalia that ended the European wars of religion, that killed an estimated 10 million people. And so on a really cold, crisp winter's day, I trudged through the snow in Munster to see where the Peace of Westphalia was signed in 1648. And remember just these basic principles that we learnt out of conflict and fighting over differing beliefs and values. The idea that the state does not tell us what to think, feel, believe, or value. The idea that we do think and value differently, and there will be conflict over that, and we just have to tolerate what we dislike in one another. And the bottom line, that when we disagree, we don't resort to violence. Now, that's kind of looking for a fairly low bottom line in some ways. This isn't a utopian vision of an ideal society. It's just trying to avoid the worst. But after working for 17 years in public policy, I lost a lot of confidence that I could always achieve a great deal of good, however much I wanted to make a difference for good. My first principle was always the principle of non-maleficence. Well, at least try not to do any harm. And can we at least make things a little bit more bearable than they are now, particularly for people who have the least? So it's a very modest, but I think realistic ambition for politics and public policy.
Mm.
Let's just not make things worse, and if we possibly can, let's make them a little better.
Mm. We've already drawn some illustrations between academia and working in the public service this evening. And the Free Speech Union has just commissioned and received a report of research that we've done within the academy and approached senior lecturers on their perspective of academic freedom and the way that they use that within the university. And it's remarkable. We'll be releasing over the next couple of weeks our analysis of this report, but the number of academics, leaders in thought in our nation who are not able to, in their estimation, raise counter perspective to what is the prevailing perspective. And unsurprisingly, there are certain key issues that this emerges on, particularly around questions of race and colonialism and within New Zealand around the treaty and the role that should have in our society. And then, of course, around gender and the way those expressions find their place in our society as well. Given your position in both those places, do you think you feel confident to stand amongst your peers and navigate differently, or do you think that you would endure a reputational battering for that, even as a member of a minority community yourself, or taking a stand in favor of doing no harm, allowing people to have their say, let them express themselves?
Yeah, I have felt the pressure to self-censor. I've never been a full-time academic, and so I've never been on the payroll of the university. I've only been hired on contract to teach courses in the School of Government. So I had a greater degree of safety in that sense, and there wasn't so much at stake for me. I have taught controversial subjects in my course, including in a course on politics, philosophy and public policy, issues around active voluntary euthanasia at the time when the end-of-life choice bill was still going through the House. There were times I had students in the class who were students with disabilities who felt very strongly about that legislation. I found in my class that it was perfectly possible to set some ground rules around freedom of speech in ways that respected the others in the class and that were civil. Mm-hmm. And I never felt we had a failure of that in the class, and I was always grateful for it. But I certainly do understand the risk of self-censorship, and I'll be really interested to see what the survey has to say.
Mm-hmm. One of the ways that a lot of people suggest addressing, introducing the civility of sorts, is a voluntary code that, like a code of conduct of sorts, that will bind people to operating under certain rules. And here at the Free Speech Union this year, we've had a few big wins. We've been able to work with the government in not introducing the hate speech up until this point, if we can say work with the government in that way. But also the representation of the Listener 7 and the issues that were raised there. But also we were able to work with NetSafe in the suggestion of the voluntary code that they were putting forward for online safety. And we were concerned with what the implications of this code could be. Do you think that non-coercive voluntary codes like this are a route forward, or do you think that in that they're non-accountable, they're not held by any representative body, they actually don't have a recourse if they do go afoul to being drawn back in at all?
Yeah, I think they do have a place. But before developing one in a little country like New Zealand, I think we'd be very wise to look at how other jurisdictions have managed this.
Mm.
And it goes back to my question of, well, who really calls the shots in a democracy? And I think government has to be involved in at least setting some of the framework and parameters around that, so that there is accountability back to the people's representatives in Parliament, and always with opportunities for review and appeal.
Whenever we have politicians join us for these conversations, unsurprisingly, they're very quick to assert the sovereignty of Parliament and the fact that ultimately they should be the buck should stop with them in terms of the redress. And while that may seem at one level self-interested, that is also the function of our representatives there. And it is important that we have people fighting to remain the voices in these very complex spaces where people have a tendency to try and impose coercive restrictions. Dr. Bromell, thank you so much for your time this evening. As we've gone through this speaking series, it's always interesting to have a variety of different commentators come and join us, but I don't think we've had anyone quite as thoughtful or entrenched in an understanding of the different components. So thank you so much for sharing your insights with us. Genuinely, if I can say to our viewers tonight, the book that Dr. Bromell has just released, Regulation of Free Speech in a Digital Age, is one that I think many leaders will be referring to in the coming decade as we try and assess these very tricky questions. And I think, not that I'm a leader in that space per se, but I thoroughly enjoyed reading this. But thank you also to our viewers for joining us tonight. I can see that we've had several dozen people join us from start to end and a number of others jumping in between. So I hope it's been an enjoyable conversation for you. And just a reminder, we will be joined with Jacob Mchangama from Denmark next week, another author who has written a very important piece on free speech in our speakeasy. So I hope we'll see you then. But Dr. Bromell, thank you for your time.
Thanks, Jonathan.
Good night.